The sun had barely risen when the small apartment slowly came to life. The single father woke up before the alarm, as he usually did. Years of responsibility had trained his mind to wake early, even on weekends. For a moment, he lay still, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet breathing of his child in the next room. That soft sound always brought him peace. Life had not gone the way he once imagined. A few years earlier, everything had fallen apart almost overnight. Since then, every day had been about survival, stability, and doing the best he could for the small person who depended on him. There were no shortcuts, no easy breaks, just long days at work and longer nights making sure homework was finished. Dinner was cooked, and bills were paid. That morning was different, though. It was Saturday, and for once he had promised something special. A small voice called from the other room. "Are we still going?" He smiled before even answering. "Yes, get ready." The sound of quick footsteps followed. Within minutes, the child appeared in the doorway, already wearing a bright shirt and holding a small toy bucket. Excitement filled the room instantly. The beach was not far from the city, but somehow they had never managed to go together before. Work schedules, school responsibilities, and everyday stress always got in the way. But this weekend, he had finally decided nothing would stop them. Breakfast was simple: toast, fruit, and juice. The child could barely sit still long enough to eat. Every few seconds, another question came. Will there be big waves? Can we build a giant sand castle? Do crabs really walk sideways? He laughed quietly and answered every question with patience. These small moments meant everything to him. They reminded him why he kept pushing forward, even when life felt overwhelming. By mid-morning, they were on their way. The road to the beach was filled with sunlight. The car windows were slightly open, letting warm air flow inside. Music played softly while the child looked out the window, pointing excitedly whenever the ocean started appearing in the distance. When they finally arrived, the parking lot was already busy. Families carried umbrellas, coolers, and beach chairs. Children ran across the sand while seagulls circled above. The moment the car door opened, the child jumped out with pure joy. "Race you?" He laughed and followed more slowly, carrying the bag filled with towels, snacks, and sunscreen. The sand felt warm under his feet as they walked toward the water. The ocean stretched endlessly across the horizon, shining under the bright sun. Waves rolled toward the shore in steady rhythm. For a moment, he just stood there, breathing in the salty air. It had been a long time since he allowed himself to relax like this. They found a small spot near the middle of the beach. He spread out a towel, while the child immediately started digging into the sand with the toy bucket. Within minutes, the giant sand castle project had begun. Time passed quickly. They built towers, dug moats, and laughed when the waves came close enough to destroy their work. Sometimes the child ran toward the water, and he followed close behind, making sure the waves were safe. The beach was crowded, but it felt peaceful at the same time. People talked, laughed, and enjoyed the sunshine. It was the kind of simple day he had always hoped to give his child. After a while, the child spotted a colorful kite flying high in the sky. "Look, can we go closer?" The kite was being flown farther down the shoreline where the crowd thinned out. He nodded, and they started walking along the water. The wind was stronger there. The kite danced in the air as the person holding the string laughed with friends nearby. The child watched with wide eyes, completely fascinated. Soon the wind shifted, and the kite suddenly dipped lower. "Catch it!" the child shouted, running forward. He followed quickly, trying to keep up. The child chased the kite as it drifted farther down the beach. In the excitement, neither of them noticed how far they had walked away from the crowded area. The noise of the main beach slowly faded behind them. This part of the shoreline was quieter. Fewer people were around. Tall rocks stood near the edge of the water, and small waves rolled gently across the sand. The kite finally lifted higher again and drifted away toward the sky. The child laughed and ran back toward him. "Did you see that?" He nodded, catching his breath. They had walked farther than he realized. "Let's head back before we get lost," he said. But as they turned around, something unexpected happened. Near the water, not far away, someone stood alone facing the ocean. The person had just stepped out of the water and was reaching for a towel on a nearby chair. At first, he didn't pay much attention. Then the person turned slightly, and everything froze. Even from that distance, he recognized the face instantly. It was his boss, the woman who ran the entire department at his workplace. The same person whose serious voice filled the meeting room every Monday morning. The same person employees often described as strict, confident, and impossible to impress. He stared in disbelief for half a second before quickly looking away. His heart jumped. This was the last place he ever expected to see her. Panic rushed through his mind. The situation was painfully awkward. She clearly believed she was in a quiet, private area of the beach. And now one of her employees had just walked into that moment completely by accident. He immediately turned his back and spoke quickly. "Let's go this way." The child looked confused, but followed him. But before they could walk far, he heard her voice. "Wait!" He stopped. Slowly he turned around. She had already wrapped the towel around herself and was now standing beside the chair, looking directly at him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The ocean waves filled the silence. He cleared his throat awkwardly. "I'm really sorry. We didn't mean to come over here. We were just chasing a kite." He expected anger, or at least annoyance. But instead, she surprised him. Her expression wasn't angry at all. If anything, she looked slightly amused. "You look more nervous than someone who just chased a kite," she said calmly. He rubbed the back of his neck. "Embarrassed. This is unexpected." "That's one way to describe it," she replied. The child stood beside him quietly, watching the conversation without understanding the strange tension between the adults. She glanced down at the child, and her expression softened. "Is this your little partner in the kite chase?" He nodded. "Yes." The child gave a small wave. For the first time since the conversation began, the situation felt slightly less uncomfortable. The wind moved gently across the beach. Seagulls called somewhere above. She looked back at him with a thoughtful expression. "You don't look like the same person from the office," she said. He blinked in confusion. "What do you mean?" "At work you're always serious. Quiet. Focused." She gestured lightly toward the sand castle bucket the child was still holding. "But here you look like someone enjoying life." He didn't know how to respond. The truth was simple. Work and life had always been two separate worlds for him. At the office, he focused on responsibility. At home, he focused on being a father. Those worlds rarely crossed paths. Until now, he glanced toward the path, leading back to the crowded part of the beach. "We should probably head back." She nodded slowly. "Probably." But something about her expression suggested she was thinking about the situation differently than he was. As he turned to leave with his child, he couldn't shake the strange feeling that this accidental meeting had just changed something. Not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, unexpected way that neither of them fully understood yet. And as they walked back toward the busy beach, he had no idea that this moment, the one he wished had never happened, would soon become something neither of them could forget. The walk back to the crowded part of the beach felt longer than before. The single father kept replaying the moment in his mind. Of all the places he could have gone that day, he had somehow walked straight into the one person he least expected to see. His boss, the person who ran the office with calm authority and rarely showed emotion. At work, everyone spoke carefully around her. Meetings were quiet when she entered the room. People respected her, but they were also slightly afraid of making mistakes in front of her. And now she had seen him chasing a kite along the beach with sand on his feet, and a child laughing beside him. He wasn't sure why that made him nervous, but it did. The child walked happily beside him, completely unaware of the tension. "That kite was amazing," the child said. "Did you see how high it went?" "I saw," he replied, forcing a small smile. They returned to their towel and sandcastle area. The beach looked just as lively as before, but his thoughts were somewhere else now. He tried to focus on the day, reminding himself that it had simply been an accident. People ran into co-workers in unexpected places all the time. Still, he couldn't stop wondering what she thought about the whole situation. Did she find it awkward? Embarrassing? Strange? He shook the thoughts away and helped the child rebuild the sandcastle that the waves had destroyed earlier. They spent time digging tunnels and stacking wet sand carefully to make the tower stronger. For a while, things returned to normal. The sound of waves and laughter slowly pushed his worries aside. Later in the afternoon, the sun climbed higher, and the heat grew stronger. The child started getting hungry, which meant it was time for a break. "Let's find something to eat," he said. The child immediately agreed. Not far from the beach entrance, there was a small cafe that served simple food and cold drinks. Families often stopped there to rest before returning to the water. They walked along the wooden path that led off the sand. The cafe sat under a wide roof with open windows that allowed the ocean breeze to pass through. Wooden tables filled the space, and the smell of grilled sandwiches and coffee drifted through the air. They found a small table near the corner. The child sat down and began looking around curiously while he walked to the counter to order food. A few minutes later, he returned with sandwiches, juice, and a cold drink. The child was halfway through the sandwich before suddenly looking toward the entrance. "Look," the child whispered. He turned casually and froze again. She had just walked into the cafe. His boss. Her hair was still slightly damp from the ocean, and she wore simple beach clothes now, without the formal work outfit and serious office setting. She looked like a completely different person. For a moment, he considered pretending he hadn't noticed her, but it was too late. Their eyes met across the room. There was a brief pause. Then she smiled slightly and walked toward their table. He felt his shoulders tighten as she approached. "Mind if I sit for a moment?" she asked. The question surprised him. He quickly nodded. "Of course." She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. The child looked between them with curiosity. "This place was more crowded than I expected," she said calmly. "It usually is on weekends," he replied. For a few seconds there was silence. The sound of the cafe filled the space around them. Plates clinking, people talking, the ocean breeze moving to the open windows. Then she looked at the child. "So," she said gently, "are you the kite expert?" The child nodded proudly. "It almost fell, but I chased it." She laughed softly. "That sounds like a serious mission." The child smiled and returned to eating. The conversation slowly shifted back to the two adults. He still felt slightly uncomfortable. At work, he always spoke carefully with her, choosing words that sounded professional and precise. But here the situation was completely different. She seemed relaxed, almost curious. "You never mentioned you had a child," she said after a moment. He shrugged slightly. "It never came up." "That's surprising," she replied. "Work meetings usually focus on projects, not family," he said. "That's true." She leaned back slightly in the chair, studying him in a thoughtful way. "You bring the child here often?" "No," he said honestly. "This is actually our first time." "First time?" He nodded. "Weekends usually disappear quickly. There's always something that needs to be done." She seemed to understand what he meant without him explaining further. "Being a single parent can't be easy," she said quietly. The words caught him slightly off guard. Most people avoided mentioning it directly. They either pretended not to notice or spoke about it with awkward sympathy. But her tone sounded calm and respectful. "It has its moments," he said. She glanced at the child again, who was now drinking juice happily. "You seem to manage well." He didn't answer right away. Managing well was a complicated idea. There were nights when he barely slept, mornings when he rushed to get everything ready before work, evenings filled with homework, cooking, cleaning, and preparing for the next day. But none of that needed to be explained here. "We try," he finally said. She nodded slowly. For a moment she seemed lost in thought. Then she spoke again. "You know something?" "What?" "You look different today." He blinked. "Different how?" "At the office you're always quiet, focused. You do your work and leave." "That's usually the plan," he said with a small smile. "But here," she continued, glancing at the child again, "you look more relaxed." He laughed lightly. "That might be the beach effect." "Maybe." She took a sip of her drink and looked out the cafe window toward the ocean. "You're good at your job," she said suddenly. The statement surprised him. "Thank you. I don't say that often," she added. "I noticed," he joked gently. That made her laugh. The sound was unexpected. At work, she rarely laughed like that. The child looked up curiously. "Did I miss something funny?" the child asked. "No," she said warmly. "We were just talking about work." The child nodded. satisfied with the explanation. For the next few minutes, the conversation moved easily between simple topics: school, favorite beach games, and the challenge of building sandcastles that survive waves. Something about the setting made everything feel natural. Eventually, she checked the time on her phone. "I should probably head out soon," she said. He nodded. "Long drive back." "A little." She stood from the table and picked up her bag. Then she looked at him again, her expression thoughtful. "Today was unexpected," she said. "That's one way to describe it. But not unpleasant," she added. "That surprised him again." She looked at the child and smiled. "Good luck with the next kite chase." "We'll catch it next time," the child said confidently. "I believe it." Then she turned to him one last time. "Enjoy the rest of your day." "You too." She walked toward the exit and disappeared into the bright afternoon sunlight. For several seconds, he simply sat there, watching the doorway. The child finally spoke. "Your friend seems nice." He smiled slightly. "She's my boss." The child's eyes widened. "Your boss?" "Yes." The child thought about that for a moment. "Well, she still seems nice." He chuckled quietly. Maybe the child was right. As they finished their meal and returned toward the beach, one thought stayed in his mind. The woman he had worked under for years suddenly seemed like a completely different person. And somehow, an awkward accident at the beach had started a conversation neither of them had expected. A conversation that felt far from finished. The afternoon sun had softened slightly by the time they walked back toward the sand. The breeze from the ocean felt cooler now, and the beach was still full of life. Children were running along the water. People were swimming, and colorful umbrellas lined the shore. The child ran ahead again, eager to return to the sandcastle project. He followed at a slower pace, carrying the bag over his shoulder. His thoughts were still drifting back to the cafe conversation. It had been strange seeing his boss outside the office, talking casually like an ordinary person. At work, she was always calm and serious, focused only on results and deadlines. But today she had laughed, asked about his life, and even spent time talking with his child. It didn't match the image everyone in the office had of her. He reached their spot and placed the bag down while the child immediately started digging again. "Let's make the walls bigger this time," the child said. "Good idea," he replied. They worked side by side, using wet sand to shape tall towers. The child carefully filled a bucket and flipped it over, trying to make the tower stronger than before. A wave rolled closer than expected and knocked part of the wall down. "Oh no," the child cried. "It's okay," he said with a smile. "That's part of the fun." They rebuilt the wall together, laughing when the sand collapsed again. For a while the world felt simple. Just a parent and a child enjoying a peaceful day by the ocean. But not far away, someone else had returned to the beach. After leaving the cafe earlier, his boss had walked along the shoreline for a while. The quiet conversation kept replaying in her mind. She had never expected to see one of her employees on a weekend like this, especially not in such an unexpected situation. But what stayed with her wasn't the awkward moment at the water earlier. It was the way he had been with his child. There had been something genuine about it. At the office, she had always seen him as reliable but quiet, the kind of employee who completed tasks without drawing attention. He rarely spoke about his personal life, and he never used excuses. Now she realized there was much more behind that quiet attitude. She spotted him again not far down the beach. The child was kneeling in the sand while he helped shape the walls of a castle. She stopped walking for a moment and watched from a distance. The scene was simple but meaningful. The child laughed loudly whenever the sand collapsed, and he patiently helped rebuild it every time without frustration. Most people would have become tired or distracted after a while, but he stayed focused, giving the child his full attention. She continued watching quietly. Eventually, the child stood up and ran toward the water again. "Look how big the waves are," the child shouted. He quickly followed behind, keeping a careful eye as the child stepped closer to the edge of the water. The waves weren't dangerous, but they were strong enough to knock someone off balance. She noticed how quickly he moved whenever the child got too close. Not controlling, not overly strict, just careful. The kind of care that came from experience. For reasons she couldn't fully explain, The moment made her feel thoughtful. She had spent years building her career. Long hours, constant pressure, and endless responsibilities had become normal. Personal life had slowly taken a back seat until it barely existed at all. Watching this small moment between father and child reminded her how different their lives were. The child ran back to the sandcastle again, soaking wet from the knees down. "Did you see that wave?" the child asked excitedly. "I saw it," he replied, laughing. "You almost fell." "But I didn't." "That's true." The child grabbed a bucket again and returned to work on the castle. As they worked, he suddenly noticed someone standing a short distance away. It was her, his boss. For a second, he wondered if he should pretend not to notice again, but she was already walking closer. "Looks like the castle is getting bigger," she said. The child looked up first. "Yes, but the waves keep destroying it." "That sounds like a tough battle," she replied with a smile. The child nodded seriously. "We're going to win this time." "I believe you." She turned her attention toward him. "I didn't expect to see you again so soon." "Neither did I," he admitted. She glanced at the sandcastle. "Mind if I watch the construction project?" "Not at all." She stood nearby while the child continued working with determination. After a moment, she crouched down slightly to look closer at the castle. "This tower looks strong," she said. "I made that one," the child said proudly. "Impressive work." The child grinned. He couldn't help noticing how natural she seemed now. There was none of the usual professional distance she maintained at the office. Here she was simply another person enjoying the beach. After a few minutes, the child ran toward the water again to collect more wet sand. That left the two adults standing quietly near the castle. She watched the child running along the shore. "You handle everything alone?" she asked. He understood what she meant. "Yes." "How long has it been like that?" "A few years." She nodded slowly. "That must have been difficult." "It was," he said honestly. He didn't usually talk about it, especially not with someone from work. But something about the peaceful setting made the conversation feel easier. "The first year was the hardest," he continued, "learning how to balance everything. Work, school, life, all of it. And you never mentioned any of that at the office. I didn't want special treatment." She studied his face carefully. "Most people would have asked for it." "Maybe," he said, "but I'd rather earn respect for my work." She seemed impressed by the answer. The child returned carrying a bucket full of wet sand. "More supplies," the child announced. "Perfect timing," he said. Together, they continued building the castle walls. To his surprise, she knelt down and helped pack the sand around one of the towers. "Like this?" she asked the child. "Yes, that makes it stronger." For the next few minutes, the three of them worked on the castle together. People walked by, waves rolled in, and seagulls circled overhead. The moment felt oddly peaceful. Eventually, a wave came in stronger than the others and knocked down one entire side of the castle. The child gasped. "Oh no!" He laughed. "That wave was powerful." The child looked disappointed for a moment. Then she spoke gently. "You know something?" "What?" the child asked. "The best builders don't stop when things fall down." The child looked at the broken wall, then slowly smiled again. "Okay, let's rebuild it." He watched the scene quietly. His boss, someone known for strict meetings and serious decisions, was now kneeling in the sand encouraging a child to rebuild a sandcastle. If someone from the office saw this, they probably wouldn't believe it. But what surprised him most was how natural it felt. The child started rebuilding the wall with new determination. She stood up and brushed the sand off her hands. "I should probably let you two continue the construction project," she said. "Thanks for helping," the child replied. "My pleasure." She looked at him one more time. "You're doing a good job," she said quietly. "With the castle?" he asked jokingly. "With everything." For a moment, he didn't know what to say. She gave a small smile and began walking back along the beach. He watched her go, thinking about her words. Then the child tugged his arm. "Come on," the child said. "We still have to finish the castle." He smiled and knelt back down in the sand. But as they worked, he couldn't help feeling that something important had shifted that day. Not in a dramatic way, Just a quiet understanding between two people who had finally seen parts of each other's lives that had always remained hidden before. The weekend passed faster than he expected. After finishing their sandcastle battle with the waves, he and the child stayed at the beach until the sun began to lower in the sky. The orange light reflected across the water, and the air became cooler. By the time they packed their towels and toys, the child was already yawning. The drive home was quiet. The child fell asleep in the back seat halfway through the ride, still holding the small toy bucket used to build the sandcastle. He glanced in the rearview mirror and smiled softly. Days like that didn't happen often, but when they did, they made every long week worth it. But as the car moved through the evening traffic, his thoughts slowly returned to the unexpected encounters at the beach. Seeing his boss there had been surprising enough. Talking with her at the cafe had been even stranger. And watching her kneel in the sand helping build a castle with his child felt almost impossible to imagine in the office environment. He wondered if things would feel awkward on Monday. Part of him hoped everything would return to normal. The office was a place for work, not personal stories or beach memories. Still, something about the way she had spoken to him stayed in his mind. "You're doing a good job with everything." No one had said something like that to him in a long time. By the time they reached home, the sky was dark. He carried the sleeping child inside and gently placed him on the bed. After removing the sandy shoes and covering them with a blanket, he quietly closed the door. The apartment returned to its usual silence. He cleaned the beach bag, washed the towels, and prepared things for the next day. The routine was familiar and comforting. Eventually, he sat down for a moment, exhausted but peaceful. The beach day had been a rare break from normal life. Monday morning arrived quickly. The alarm rang early, and the usual routine began again. Breakfast, getting ready for school, checking homework, and making sure everything was packed properly. After dropping the child off, he drove toward the office building. The tall glass structure looked the same as always. Employees walked through the entrance carrying coffee cups and laptops, preparing for another busy week. As he stepped inside, the quiet professional atmosphere returned instantly. Conversations were polite and focused. Phones rang softly in the distance. People moved quickly between desks and meeting rooms. Everything felt normal. He greeted a few co-workers and walked to his desk. For the first hour, he focused on emails and reports, trying to concentrate on the day's tasks. But part of him remained curious. Would she act differently after the weekend? Would she mention anything about the beach? Or would they both simply pretend it never happened? Late in the morning, a message appeared on his computer screen. Meeting in the conference room. 10 minutes. The message came from her. He took a slow breath and stood up. Meetings with her were usually serious. She preferred efficiency and clear answers. Employees prepared carefully before speaking in those rooms. As he walked toward the conference area, he noticed several co-workers heading there as well. It looked like a normal team meeting. That gave him some relief. When he entered the room, people were already seated around the table. Laptops were open and documents were spread across the surface. She stood near the front of the room, reviewing notes on a tablet. For a moment their eyes met. Her expression didn't change. She simply nodded slightly, the same way she greeted everyone else. The meeting began a minute later. She spoke confidently, explaining new goals for an upcoming project. Her voice carried the same calm authority everyone recognized. To anyone watching, nothing about her behavior seemed different, but something small did change. During the discussion, she asked for ideas about a problem the team had been trying to solve for weeks. Several people suggested solutions, but none fully addressed the issue. Then she looked in his direction. "What do you think?" she asked. The room became quiet. He wasn't used to speaking much during these meetings. Usually he listened and completed the tasks assigned afterward. But now everyone was looking at him. He cleared his throat slightly. "I think the problem isn't the timeline," he said carefully. "It's the way the information is being shared between departments." He explained his ideas simply, suggesting a new system that would allow teams to communicate updates faster. As he spoke, she listened closely. When he finished, she nodded. "That makes sense." A few co-workers looked surprised. She continued speaking. "Let's test that approach this week. The meeting moved forward, but the small moment didn't go unnoticed. Afterward, as employees left the room, a few people glanced at him with curiosity. One co-worker whispered quietly, "Nice idea." He returned to his desk, wondering what had just happened. Later that afternoon, another message appeared. "Stop by my office when you have a moment." He walked down the hallway toward her office door. The glass walls allowed sunlight to fill the space inside. He knocked lightly. "Come in," she said. He stepped inside and closed the door. She looked up from her desk. "Relax," she said with a faint smile. "You look like you're about to face an interview." He chuckled slightly. "Old habits." She gestured toward the chair across from her. "Sit." He sat down. For a moment she reviewed a document on her screen, then turned her attention back to him. "That idea you shared earlier was good," she said. "Thank you. You've had that thought for a while, haven't you?" He nodded. "I just wasn't sure when to bring it up." She leaned back slightly. "You should bring those ideas up more often." "I didn't want to interrupt the process." "Sometimes the process needs interruption," she replied calmly. He smiled at the comment. There was a short pause. Then she spoke again, her tone slightly more casual. "How was the rest of your weekend?" The question caught him off guard. "Good," he said. "The beach tired someone out." "I imagine so." She looked thoughtful for a moment. "That was a good sandcastle," she added quietly. He laughed. "The waves eventually won." "They usually do." For a second the office setting seemed to fade, replaced by the memory of the sunny beach and the child laughing in the sand. Then she returned to the topic of work. "I meant what I said the other day," she continued. "About what?" "You're doing a good job." He didn't answer immediately. Most managers simply focused on performance numbers and deadlines. Encouraging words were rare. "I appreciate that," he finally said. She nodded once. "You've handled a lot without letting it affect your work." He understood what she meant. "I try." She stood up and walked toward the window for a moment, looking down at the busy street below. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "people are often more complicated than we assume at the office." "That's probably true." She turned back toward him. "Anyway, we have a lot of work ahead this month. Your idea will help." He nodded. "I'll start working on the details." "Good." The conversation ended there. He stood and prepared to leave. As he reached the door, she added one more sentence. "And if your construction team ever needs another sandcastle assistant." He looked back, smiling. "I'll keep that in mind." He stepped out into the hallway feeling slightly lighter than usual. Behind him, she returned to her desk and continued reviewing the day's reports. But something had definitely changed since that quiet weekend at the beach. Not in a way that others could easily see. Just a new level of understanding between two people who had briefly stepped outside the walls of the office and seen each other's real lives. The weeks after that meeting passed quickly. Work became busier as a new project moved forward, but something had quietly shifted inside the office. Most people didn't notice it right away, but he did. Before the beach weekend, his boss rarely asked for his opinion during discussions. Now, every once in a while, she would pause during meetings and look in his direction. "What do you think?" The first few times it happened, the room grew silent. Co-workers exchanged quick glances, as if trying to understand why she suddenly wanted to hear from a quiet employee who usually stayed in the background. But he didn't treat it like special treatment. When she asked something, he simply answered honestly and focused on solving the problem. Nothing more. Gradually, the team noticed something else. His ideas often worked, not because they were complicated or dramatic, but because they were practical. Years of balancing work and home life had forced him to become efficient. He had learned how to look for solutions that actually helped people instead of just sounding impressive. One afternoon, while reviewing progress on the project, the team ran into a major problem with the schedule. The deadline was approaching faster than expected, and several departments were struggling to coordinate their work. Frustration started spreading through the meeting room. People talked over each other, suggesting quick fixes that would probably create more problems later. She listened quietly for a few minutes. Then she raised her hand slightly. The room fell silent. Her eyes moved around the table before stopping on him again. "What do you suggest?" He leaned forward slightly, thinking for a moment. I think everyone is trying to move too fast, he said. If we slow down for a day and organize the communication between teams, the rest of the week will go smoother. Someone across the table frowned. A whole day? That might delay things. He shook his head calmly. It won't delay anything if it prevents mistakes later. The room became quiet again. She nodded slowly. Let's try it. The decision surprised some people, but the next few days proved the idea right. Once the teams reorganized their communication, the workflow improved immediately. Tasks that had been stuck for weeks suddenly moved forward. By the end of the week, the project was back on schedule. After the final meeting that Friday afternoon, most employees packed their bags and hurried out of the office to start the weekend. He stayed behind to finish a few reports. As he gathered his papers, he noticed someone standing near the doorway of the conference room. It was her. "Do you have a minute?" she asked. "Of course." They walked toward the quieter side of the office where the large windows overlooked the city streets below. Evening sunlight reflected off the glass buildings nearby, turning the sky a soft orange. She rested her hands lightly on the edge of the table. "That communication idea worked well," she said. "I'm glad." She looked thoughtful for a moment. "You're used to solving problems like that, aren't you?" He shrugged slightly. "Life teaches you to organize things." She smiled faintly. "I suppose it does." For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then she asked something that sounded more personal than usual. "How is your child?" He relaxed a little at the question. "Doing well. School is going great." "That's good." She looked out the window again, watching cars move slowly along the busy road below. "You know," she said quietly, "that day at the beach stayed in my mind." He chuckled softly. "Not exactly my most professional moment." "That's not what I remember," she replied. He waited. She turned slightly toward him. "What I remember is seeing someone who was completely focused on what mattered most to him." He didn't respond right away. She continued. "At the office, we often judge people based on small pieces of their lives. Job titles, performance numbers, deadlines. That's true. But that day reminded me something important." "What's that?" "That people carry entire worlds outside these office walls." Her voice sounded thoughtful, almost reflective. "I built most of my life around work," she said. "For a long time, I believed that was enough." He listened quietly. "But watching you that afternoon," she continued, "I realized something I hadn't thought about in years." He raised an eyebrow slightly. "What did you realize?" She smiled gently. "That success can look very different depending on how you measure it." The words hung in the air between them. He understood what she meant. For him, success had never been about titles or promotions. It was about keeping life stable, giving his child a safe home, and making sure tomorrow was a little better than today. She folded her arms loosely. "That's why I respected the way you handled everything." "The sandcastle," he joked. "The responsibility," she corrected. He nodded slowly. "Sometimes it doesn't feel like success," he admitted. "Sometimes it just feels like surviving the week." She laughed softly. "I imagine many parents feel the same way." Outside the window, the sun slowly disappeared behind the buildings. The office floor had grown quiet as the last employees left for the day. She looked back at him with a thoughtful expression. "You know something else?" "What?" "You never asked for sympathy or special treatment." "I didn't need it." "Exactly." That seemed to impress her even more. A few moments later, she picked up her bag from the chair beside the table. "I should get going," she said. "Me too." They walked together toward the elevator area. The hallway lights had dimmed slightly as the building prepared for the evening. Before the elevator doors opened, she spoke again. "I was thinking about something." "About what?" "The beach." He smiled. "That place seems to come up often lately." "There's a reason," she said. "And what's that?" "I never actually finished helping build that sandcastle." He laughed. "The waves made sure of that. Maybe next time we'll build one stronger." The elevator doors opened. They stepped inside and rode down to the ground floor in comfortable silence. When the doors opened again, the evening air greeted them as they walked outside. People passed by on the sidewalk, heading toward restaurants, buses, and homes. She paused near the entrance. Have a good weekend, she said. You too. She started walking toward the parking area, then stopped and turned back for a moment. By the way, she added, if your child ever wants another beach day, I might know a few tricks for building stronger castle walls. He smiled. I'll let the construction manager know. She laughed and continued toward her car. He stood there for a moment, watching the city lights slowly turn on across the street. Life would probably return to its usual routine after that. Work meetings, school mornings, grocery shopping, bedtime stories. But something important had happened because of a simple accident at the beach. Two people who once only knew each other through work had discovered something deeper about the lives behind their professional roles. And sometimes those unexpected moments were the ones that quietly changed how people saw the world around them. As he walked toward his own car, he already knew what his child would ask that weekend. Can we go back to beach? This time, he had a feeling the answer might lead to another unexpected story.